The ability to simplify means to eliminate the unnecessary so that the necessary may speak. Hans Hofmann. Look at your calendar, or that detailed spreadsheet you spent multiple hours tweaking and getting just right. For you overachievers, you might have even color-coded components within it. Looks nice, doesn't it? You're proud of your work. But let's be honest, it's a lie. To a degree, what you've actually done is built a prison out of your good intentions. You've created this incredibly intricate workflow because it makes you feel like you're being productive. It makes you feel like you're in control. But as soon as real life hits, your child gets sick, a client changes their mind, or you just wake up not feeling it that day, that well-thought-out plan can quickly implode. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. We do this to ourselves constantly, and not just at work. We overcomplicate our fitness goals, our diets, and our relationships. We add layer after layer of rules and expectations until we almost suffocate underneath the weight of them. You're trading actual progress for the illusion of importance. If your plan requires perfect conditions to succeed, it's not a plan, it's a fantasy. Complexity is a hiding place. It's where we go when we're afraid to face the simplicity of what actually needs to be done. It's easy to get lost in the details. It's much harder to strip away the noise and look at the core. We act like complexity means commitment, but complicated isn't the same thing as disciplined. And one of the easiest ways to feel productive without actually doing anything is to give yourself more options, more plans, more backup plans for the backup plan. Because having options means you're being flexible. You don't want to miss a better opportunity or commit to something too early. But there's a point where options stop creating freedom and start creating drag. Every option keeps a decision unmade or unaddressed. And every decision that stays alive keeps taking energy. You wake up and you start negotiating with your thoughts. Should I work out or should I rest? Commit now or wait until I'm more prepared? Stay with this plan or redesign it? And more often than not, less instead of more ends up happening. You just burn small amounts of energy over and over until doing nothing starts feeling reasonable. Because that's the maze of indecision that we get stuck in. We think we need more information before we act. We feel that we need to be more certain and have more confidence in what we're going to do, but most of the time, we actually don't. What we really need is fewer open doors. Because when everything stays available, nothing gets chosen. And that doesn't just mean with your goals. It happens in our careers, relationships, our finances, and our daily routines. We become exhausted not because life is impossible, but because we're carrying 10 possible versions of our life at the same time. That's the silent cost to keeping options open. You never fully commit. You never find out whether something would have worked because you keep changing the conditions before anything has time to pan out. Then once something gets complicated enough, failure stops being a possibility and starts becoming a probability. Because complexity creates more places for things to break. A plan with one moving part only has one demand of you. A plan with a dozen moving parts requires timing, consistency, coordination, attention to detail, and usually a little bit of luck. And in most instances, we don't usually account for all of it. We create our systems and our plans more based on our best day, when our energy is high, when we're in a good mood, and when we're full of motivation. But then we act surprised when that system falls apart on those days that aren't our best. However, we rarely blame the system. We blame ourselves when things don't go according to the plan, because that's taking ownership. You'll convince yourself that you just need more discipline. But discipline isn't the ability to maintain unnecessary complexity. Discipline is doing what matters when conditions aren't ideal. You can see this in small ways. You create a morning routine that has so many steps that you abandon it after a couple weeks. You build a business workflow with multiple tracking points and analytic reports that you end up spending more time managing the flow than doing the work. You want better communication in a relationship, but turn every conversation into a Venn diagram instead of just saying what you mean. It's all the layers that become the obstacles. And then you start protecting the system instead of pursuing the outcome. You defend the routine, adjust the template, or redesign the schedule. Meanwhile, the original goal sits untouched. However, here's where this gets uncomfortable. We don't make things complicated because we don't know any better. Many times we make things complicated because simple leaves nowhere to hide. A simple standard is exposed. Walk 3 times this week. Go to bed earlier. Have that difficult conversation. Finish the thing. There's no interpretation in any of that. You either did it or you didn't. And that can feel a lot heavier than a complicated system, because complexity can create distance between intention and accountability. You can feel productive without ever testing yourself against reality, whereas simple doesn't allow that. Simple asks a harder question. Not, did you build a good plan? But rather, did you act? That's why simplicity gets mistaken for lacking depth or purpose. We often assume if something is straightforward, it must not be ambitious enough. But think about it. How often do we give more credit to the complexity of things and overlook the consistency? Someone's doing a few important things every day? That doesn't seem impressive. Someone talking about an elaborate strategy or plan? Now that sounds serious. Until some time passes, and you can evaluate the two. One person has results, and the other has explanations. That's the tension. Simple standards don't always feel good because they remove the excuses you use to negotiate with yourself. Simplicity can feel almost offensive because it raises the possibility that the next move isn't more thinking, it's doing less. Now, not everything complicated shows up in a day planner. Some of the heaviest complexity we carry lives inside our relationships. Those situations that are supposed to create support can slowly become another thing to manage. You feel like you need to rehearse conversations before having them. You spend more time predicting their reactions instead of being honest. You start creating plans for how you'll time when you'll say something, the words you'll use, and how you need to perform to keep everything stable. Then eventually, you're not relating anymore. You're moderating. And moderating takes energy. On the other hand, we often confuse this complexity with the depth of the relationship. We believe that if something requires endless analysis, emotional decoding, repeated misunderstandings, or constant tension, it must mean that it matters more. But that complexity likely isn't proof of meaning, as opposed to simply being proof that something isn't clear. Healthy relationships, they require effort. They require patience, having those difficult conversations, and being accountable. But effort and complication aren't the same thing. You shouldn't need a strategy meeting to ask for help. You shouldn't need perfect conditions to tell somebody the truth. You shouldn't have to become a different person depending on who's in the room. Because when relationships become too complicated, you stop being present in the relationship. And eventually, the relationship can start feeling like a burden because of that constant effort required to keep it functioning. Peace in a relationship is knowing where you stand, saying what you mean, and letting things be simpler than your fear tells you that are allowed to be. On the other hand, there's a question we don't ask often enough. Will this still work when life stops cooperating? Because almost everything looks effective in ideal conditions. But that's not the real test. The real test is whether the standard survives contact with an ordinary day. This is where simple starts separating itself from complicated. Simple travels. It works when you're busy. It works when you're tired. It works when things aren't perfect. Because simple removes unnecessary dependence. That matters more than most of us realize. A complicated system usually requires alignment. A simple system requires commitment. One depends on circumstances, while the other depends on a decision. And that difference starts showing up over time. People who make progress don't always have more discipline, more time, or more talent. Most of the time, they just have fewer conditions attached to their actions. They don't negotiate with themselves every day. They don't treat every difficult situation like evidence that the whole plan needs to change. They just keep showing up with a purpose. Now, that doesn't mean that life becomes easier. It means the standard is portable. And maybe that's the better question to ask yourself. Not whether your plan works. Not whether your routine sounds good. Not whether your system impresses other people. Instead, if tomorrow gets stressful, inconvenient, and outside the bubble, what still remains executable? Because that's usually what's real. So in closing this up, strength doesn't always mean who can carry the most. Emotional strength is knowing what not to carry. Because adding isn't always progress. More structure isn't always discipline. More analysis isn't always awareness. And sometimes the hardest thing you can do is stop improving the plan long enough to determine whether it might already work. Rather, it's better to be able to look at something and admit maybe it doesn't need another layer. Maybe what's missing isn't complexity. Maybe what's missing is trust. Trust that you can do ordinary things consistently. Trust that clarity isn't weakness. Trust that progress rarely shows its face with fanfare. It usually shows up quietly, without the negotiation and the need to carry more. Then eventually one day, you notice something else. You're moving faster. You're thinking less. You're showing up more. Because you stopped asking every part of your life to prove itself before you gave it your effort. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.